So, who is Aphra Behn? And who was she writing for? And why was she writing? And who was her audience? A few things about her is that she was the first, as we said, the first English woman to earn her living by her writing. She was also a spy for Charles II and a very staunch royalist. A lot of people saw uh, royalism and monarchism not as sort of like tyranny, but as a resistance to what they had seen as the tyranny of Cromwell's reign in the interregnum. But she was somebody from a kind of middle-class family that was down on its luck and did a turn in debtor's prison, an institution that I'm glad doesn't still exist. She was a playwright and poet. She was one of the first. I think she was the first woman to write for the English stage that we know of. I mean, some of the medieval playwrights who are anonymous may have been women, but she wrote plays for the Restoration stage, and she also wrote poetry. She also wrote the romance novel Orinoco, which is the tale of a African prince who is enslaved and then leads a heroic but doomed slave rebellion. Very interesting story, which has aspects both of medieval romance and the rising genre at the time of the novel, and notes some of the early slave narratives as well. She was belonged to the coterie, a coterie that should be single, of poets and famous libertines, including John Wilmot, the Lord of Rochester. Now, your handout here this week has a discussion of libertines, but libertinism was a kind of cultural trend or movement during the Restoration that was in some ways a counter-reaction to the intense moralism and lifestyle restrictions of the puritanical rule of the interregnum government. And it was a rejection of traditional sexual morality and religious morality. The most famous of these was John Wilmot, the Lord Rochester, who was a writer of incredibly filthy lyrics. He writes a poem called The Imperfect Enjoyment, which you can find in your Norton Anthology of English Literature, Volume C. I am not going to read it to you because, honestly, I'm too much of a prude. I can barely handle discussing the disappointment with you, but it's such a great poem that I will overcome my squeamishness. But Lord John Wilmot, basically, this genre, the imperfect enjoyment, to which the disappointment belongs, is about the failure to achieve sexual fulfillment because of, how do I put this delicately, premature ejaculation. And yes, there was a whole genre of poetry that begins in French. There's a poem called L'Occasion Perdue, the lost opportunity. And so this becomes like a riff. It becomes like a game of like, and so, John Wilmot's poem, The Imperfect Enjoyment, blames the woman. But one of the things that Aphra Behn does is sort of take this this genre, this idea of a failed sexual encounter, and write it from the woman's point of view. In doing so, she does a number of things that make this a literary game, and that make her someone who's competing with male poets in a male style and idiom, writing herself into literary tradition. One of the things about this is that it's written in kind of a mock epic style. That is, that it's describing something relatively trivial or everyday, but it's writing it with, with all the fanciness and pomp and elevation and epic similes that Milton writes about the war in heaven and the fall of man. She's writing about one nymph's encounter with a young man and its less than ideal outcome. So it's definitely written in a high style, but with a low subject matter. And this is mock epic. It's also something that we might call burlesque, and we'll talk more about this with with Alexander Pope as well. But this idea of burlesque, also in your term sheet this week, we're not talking about the bump and grind kind of like erotic stage, like funny old-timey stage show. Although there's a connection, because there was there were burlesque theaters in the 19th century in Victorian England and in America that featured comedy sketches, and then more and more they started introducing striptease acts, and then the term burlesque, which had referred to like comedy or parody, then got transferred over because they were in the same kind of variety shows to the striptease acts. That's where the origin of the term burlesque, but we're using it in its original meaning here. And one of the things that Aphra Behn does in the imperfect enjoyment, in the disappointment, is to play with a whole tradition in Western literature of Ovidianism. That is a reference to Ovid, the Roman poet, and particularly his Art of Love, but also his other writing too. Ovid was enormously popular all through the Middle Ages and Renaissance. He's one of the most he's one of the authors that Shakespeare references more than anyone else. Ovid is one of the three canonical authors of the Roman world, of the High Roman world of Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. And Ovid was he famously was exiled by the Emperor Augustus for writing immoral literature. He wrote a series of love poems called the Amores, which were love elegies, which were about love affairs and stuff. And he wrote a book called the Ars Amatorii, or the Art of Love. And this was something that was, believe it or not, taught to schoolboys all through the Middle Ages and Renaissance. It was thought that if you gave them a subject that was interesting enough to them, and what's more interesting to an adolescent boy than a handbook of picking up women, right? Forgive my heterosexism here, but for the most part, this was the cultural assumption, and so that they would study their Latin and learn it very carefully because they wanted to know what was in there. And then, of course, it was moralized, and they would say, this is all what you shouldn't do. But it still remained very popular. Here's an example of a 17th century German edition of De Arte Amate, geschrieben durch Ovidium Nasonum. That's Ovidius Naso, or Ovid, as we know him. Showing the guy trying to sort of, hey, baby. Anyway, Ovid's Art of Love has a few parts of it. There's the first part is how to find a woman. He talks about appropriate places for finding for picking up women, including the theater, the games. It's like go to the gladiator show. Book 2 is how to keep a woman. And interestingly, book 3 was a book for women. Now the thing about this is that the Art of Love is very different than the courtly love tradition. One of the important things that distinguishes the Roman view of love from the medieval view of love that we see expressed in the Capellanus, for example, and romances in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is that the Middle Ages takes love far more seriously. Love is a philosophical topic. This whole idea of petrarchism, all of this takes love very seriously. It's one of the highest callings of a human being, right? For the Romans, the ancient Romans, love was kid stuff. It was silly. It was like, a physical impulse that you took care of in the most dignified or pleasurable way possible, and then moved on to the important business of public affairs and running the state and, conquering Gaul or whatever, right? So sex was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. I mean, you go back and you look at Roman graffiti, and there's like priapic figures, erections like everywhere in the graffiti at Pompeii. There's all these filthy murals. There's temple prostitution. There's a huge population of prostitutes in ancient Rome. Art of Love itself by Ovid designates the kind of women who it's talking about as being meretrix. And this word, meretrix, refers to, we get the modern English word meretricious from it, but it refers to a class of women who kind of like a high-class escort, but not specifically like prostitutes, right? They, I guess the word, like, kind of like a sugar daddy, sugar baby relationship. Sorry, I'm talking about gross stuff here, potentially, but, or distasteful things. There are things in the world, though, and there are things that literature has treated. And, so the meretrix wasn't a virgin, she wasn't a maiden, and she wasn't a matron either. She wasn't like a wife. And the idea of writing a handbook of seduction for these kinds of women would have been totally morally impermissible. As it was, Ovid gets exiled to the Black Sea by Augustus and has to live out the rest of his day like far from the Rome that he loves. But he imagines these kind of courtesans, is the word that gets used. Women who survive based on the favors of men. If you've read the Kingkiller Chronicles, the woman Denna is kind of like this kind of figure who thrives on sort of the company and the friendship and maybe sometimes the sex. And in return they get gifts. And one of the things about Ovid's Art of Love is that it's this very kind of cynical, and it has a very cynical and mercenary view of what he calls love. And it's basically like a handbook for how to get as much sex as you can with the minimum of gifts from courtesans. And then book 3 is addressed towards the women, towards these courtesans. And to them, he imparts the lessons of how to get the maximum of gifts from the minimum of sex. As we can see, this is a long way from the exalted view of love that we find in the medieval courtly lover, the Petrarchan tradition, or even the passion of Shakespeare's sonnets and Donne's and Donne's poetry that rejects the philosophical Petrarchism, but still takes love seriously. Roman poetry does not take love seriously, and Ovid especially. The other thing that we can say about Ovid's poetry is that it is very much in contradiction with the emerging moral consensus about affirmative consent, let's say, and about not stalking and harassing women. In The Art of Love, Ovid writes that you should keep writing. If a woman won't talk to you, write her a letter. And if she won't respond to the letter, keep writing her letters till she does write you a letter. And when she writes the letter back to you, even if she's saying, "Stop writing me," the fact that she's responded to you means that she really wants you and that you should keep pursuing her until you get what you want. Yeah, I know. That's not what we think of as okay. And yet, this book, The Art of Love, underlays an entire literary, hopefully more than social tradition, a literary fantasy of seduction and sexual freedom, libertinism, and particularly male libertinism, that is a part of Western culture all the way through to the 20th century. I mean, the 21st century. I mean, the first decade, you still have the classic sort of stalker narrative in your romantic comedies, right? Keep trying, keep persisting, even if she says no. Knows that there's a kind of social script. There is a sexual script that says a woman is required to say no to preserve her virtue and her dignity, her honor, and that she must continue to say no for a while until you've proven that you are persistent enough, right? And this is... It's central to our culture, whether we like it or not. Whether it should be or not, this is part of what Aphra Behn is writing about. It's part of the Ovidian tradition that she's writing her in. It's something that we see in Ovid's the Metamorphoses, where there are a series of basically there are like many attempted rapes in the Metamorphoses of Ovid. Again, I misspelled this. It's plural, Metamorphoses. In fact, there was a controversy at Columbia University a few years ago over whether there should be a trigger warning to this text, which was taught in their obligatory general ed Western civilization class. So Apollo chases Daphne, and then Daphne's father, who's a river, she's a nymph, which is a kind of goddess, takes pity on her and turns her into a laurel tree. And Apollo is the god of poetry, and this is why the laurel is still sacred to is associated with poetry, and we have poet laureates, right? And there's stories of Pan and Syrinx, Apollo and Dryope, Tereus and Philomela, and many more. There's just one story after another of attempted rape. And it's part of a cultural script, a sexual script that sees sexual pleasure as something that men extract from women, or sometimes from other men, to the disadvantage of the person who's having sex extracted from them. It's a sex love in this Ovidian tradition, awful as it is about sort of hunting, seducing, capturing, taking. So this brings us back to the disappointment of 1680. A woman seeking to write in this tradition and writing for this tradition writes about it from the woman's point of view. So let's take a look at that. All right, back to my favorite website for looking at old poetry and reading together. Let's read The Disappointment. My son watches all these Let's Play videos where they do like Minecraft or whatever. So instead of Let's Play, we're doing Let's Read. So the Disappointment. One day the amorous Lysander, by an impatient passion swayed, surprised fair Chloris, that loved maid who could defend herself no longer. All things did with his love conspire. The gilded planet of the day in his gay chariot drawn by fire was now descending to the sea, and left no light to guide the world, but what from Chloris' brighter eyes was hurled. Now we see already the elements of the high style. Instead of saying the sun was going down, we say the gilded planet of the day in his gay chariot drawn by fire was now descending to the sea. And we're in the world of classical mythology. These characters, Lysander and Chloris, are ones that we meet, shepherds and nymphs in the pastoral tradition of Virgil, and actually I think they're from Theocritus, the Greek poet who writes about love stories and stuff like that. So Chloris is a maid, she's a nymph. Lysander is I believe he's a shepherd or something like that. So where are they? In a lone thicket, made for love, silent as yielding maids consent. Problematic. But, again, that cultural script. Consent is silent, right? They say no, 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 and then when they stop saying no, that means yes. This is what Ovid teaches us. This is why I think there's so much resistance and so much kind of like quarrel and strife over the changing sexual mores and attitudes about consent in the modern world, because, basically, rape culture is old. It's very, very old. You could argue that, Helen in Paris, Western literature begins with a rape. Anyway, this poem is not about rape, though. I want to make that clear. The figures in this poem are acting in that Ovidian script, but let's see what the deal is with Chloris and how she is experiencing this, because it's her experience that is focalized by Aphra Behn. She, with a charming languishment, permits his force, yet gently strove. Her hands his bosom softly meet, but not to put him back designed, rather to draw him on inclined, whilst he lay trembling at her feet. whoa, this is a bit of a flip here. She's drawing him on. He's trembling. She is the one who's gently striving. Note all the places in this poem where the subject of the verb is Chloris, the nymph, the lady, not Lysander, the man. Her bright eyes sweat, and yet severe, where love and shame confusedly strive, fresh vigor to Lysander give. Oh, sorry, that should say her bright eyes sweet. This is the old spelling, a little confusing, huh? And whispering softly in his ear, she cried, "Cease, cease, your vain desire, or I'll call out. What would you do? My dear honor, even to you, I cannot, must not give. Retire, or take that life whose chiefest part I gave you with the conquest of my heart." This plays with the way that Aphra Behn riffs on libertine values and the libertine ideology that rejects conventional sexual morality and conventional views of honor. One of the things that Behn will write about in other works, such as her plays, is the way that the rejection of honor and conventional morality usually works out well enough for men, although John Wilmot does die of syphilis, but generally leaves women unprotected and vulnerable. There's no sort of place for women in libertinism as it was practiced by men in the 17th century. And the same critique was made about the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s. Gloria Steinem said that this was a male sexual revolution. Let's see. So she's saying, "Cease, cease your vain desire, or I'll call out. What would you do, my dear honor, even to you I cannot, must not give. But he as much unused to fear as he was capable of love." Whoa, slow down, take the needle off the record. He as much unused to fear as he was capable of love. That's a tricky, ambiguous thing there, isn't it? It doesn't really say how much those things are, just that they're the same, that he is just as unused to fear as he was capable of love. So, is that a little? Is that a lot? I don't know. The blessed minutes to improve, kisses her lips, her neck, her hair, each touch, her new desires alarms. Her new desires, right? This is about her desire. His burning, trembling hand he pressed upon her melting, snowy breast, while she lay panting in his arms. All her unguarded beauties lie, the spoils and trophies of the enemy. Again, playing with this idea of sex as conquest, as taking, as extraction. And now, without respect or fear, he seeks the object of his vows. His love no modesty allows, by swift degrees advancing where his daring hand that altar seized where gods of love do sacrifice, that awful throne, that paradise, where rage is tamed and anger pleased, that living fountain from whose trills the melted soul in liquid drops distills. Now, this is eroticism in a high style. This is an epic simile for a woman's sex, basically. And I want you to sort of, it's a rather sort of grand and exalted image for female sexuality and women's sexual parts. Her balmy lips encountering his, their bodies as their souls are joined, where both in transports were confined, extend themselves upon the moss. Chloris, half dead and breathless, lay. And remember, death means orgasm, so he's kind of basically saying that she's getting there. Her eyes appeared like humid light, such as divides the day and night, or falling stars whose fires decay. And now no signs of life she shows, but what in short breath sighs returns and goes. Again, note the focus on her experience, not his. And you only have my word on this because you haven't read probably a lot of Ovidian poetry of the late 17th century, but that's really not typical. He saw, and now here comes the disappointment. He saw how at her length she lay. He saw her rising bosom bare, her loose thin robes through which appear a shape designed for love and play, abandoned by her pride and shame. She does her softest sweets dispense, offering her virgin innocence, a victim to love's sacred flame. So far, so good. He's looking at her. She's beautiful. She's getting ready. Whilst there, over-ravished shepherd lies, unable to perform the sacrifice, referring back to this idea of her as her sex as an altar, remember? So he's over-ravished. He's done. Ready to taste 1,000 joys, the too transported hapless swain, that's another word for shepherd, found, I like the apostrophe here, the too transported hapless swain, found the vast pleasure turned to pain, pleasure which too much love destroys. The willing garments by he laid, and heaven all open to his view, mad to possess himself he threw on the defenseless lovely maid. But oh, what envious gods conspire to snatch his power, yet leave him the desire. Nature's support, without whose aid she can no human being give, itself now wants the art to live. Faintness its slackened nerves in vain. In vain the enraged youth essayed to call his fleeting vigor back. No motion 'twill from motion take. Excess of love his love betrayed. In vain he toils, in vain commands. The insensible fell weeping in his hands. So, yeah, he is slackened nerves, his motion is taken. In this so amorous cool strife, where love and fate were too severe, the poor Lysander in despair renounced his reason with his life. Now all the brisk and active fire that should the nobler part inflame, unactive, frigid, dull became, and left no spark for new desire. Not all her naked charms could move or calm that rage that had debauched his love. So these three stanzas show his state of mind, his power, and his loss, and then his rage that can't overcome his loss of power, his loss of vigor. And then we return to Chloris's point of view. Chloris, returning from the trance which love and soft desire had bred, her timorous hand she gently laid, or guided, by design or chance, upon that fabulous Priapus, that potent god, as poets feign. But never did young shepherdess, gathering a fern upon the plain, more nimbly draw her fingers back, finding beneath the verdant leaves a snake. Then Chloris her fair hand withdrew, finding that god of her desires disarmed of all his powerful fires, and cold as flowers bathed in the morning dew. Who can the nymph's confusion guess? The blood forsook the kinder place, and strewed with blushes all her face, which both disdain and shame express, and from Lysander's arms she fled, leaving him fainting on the gloomy bed. So she realizes what's happened, confusion overtakes her, and the blood returns from, by the way, that sometimes, I think one version has kinder and the other version has hinder, as in the behind, as in below. But it returns from the kinder place, and her blood comes back to her face with a blush, expressing, I love this, both disdain and shame. And she runs, like lightning through the grove she hies, or Daphne from the Delphic god, referring back to that Ovidian tradition, right? But she was ready, and she's running because of her disappointment. No print upon the grassy road she leaves to instruct pursuing eyes. The wind that wantoned in her hair and with her ruffling garments played, discovered in the flying maid all that the gods ever made fair. This is a classic painting image of a woman running away and her clothes all running up behind her. So she's playing in this, Aphra Behn is playing in this love mode. So Venus, when her love was slain, with fear and haste flew over the fatal plain, referring to Shakespeare's poem Venus and Adonis. The nymphs resent, and the final stanza here is really funny here. The nymph's resentments none but I can well imagine and condole. But none can guess Lysander's soul, but those who swayed his destiny. This is such a wonderful reversal of a whole tradition of poetry where basically she's saying, I can really sympathize with that woman and understand what she's going. Who knows what the dude was thinking? None can guess Lysander's soul, but those who swayed his destiny. His silent griefs swell up to storms, and not one god his fury spares. He cursed his birth, his fate, his stars, but more the shepherdess's charms. It was her, she was too hot. Whose swift bewitching influence had damned him to the hell of impotence. So, this poem about this it's a poem about bad sex that goes badly, and it's a poem that's meant to be funny. I think it's a poem that's making fun of male vanity, and you know, the male imagination of its own sexual potency. There's some wonderful contrasts between her, you know, how I think one of the things you can think about is the way that male sexuality is portrayed in this poem versus female sexuality, and how Aphra Behn makes use of the high style, the mock epic style, and the Ovidian tradition to rewrite the understanding of desire, and power. And there's a lot more that can be said about this, but I think there's some interesting things that go on with gender here. The way that she's made the syntax makes her out to be the actor, the agent, and he's the patient. He's the one who is passive, who's acted upon. That also plays with sexual scripts and gender roles. But it also finally speaks to, again, a relaxing of sexual mores and a frankness about sex that is hasn't been seen in Western literature since the Roman world. It doesn't last very long. The sort of libertine movement of the Restoration is quickly, within a few decades, it sort of burns itself out, as these things will. They tend to come and go in waves. Aphra Behn's reputation is sort of forgotten, or she's sort of considered distasteful. People don't really want to talk about her. But Virginia Woolf, I think, wrote that all women writers should lay flowers on the grave of Aphra Behn. She was a revolutionary in her own way, and so I hope you didn't blush too much during this. It's a little squiffy. Well, I forget the word. It's a little icky. But yeah, it's also funny. So I hope you got a laugh.